Have you ever had the feeling that someone was watching you, even when no one was there? That sense of unease that lingers just beneath your skin, the kind that makes the hairs on your arms stand on end. This is where our story begins. A quaint town where the streets seem too quiet and the shadows stretch a little too long. Mira Hastings had lived in Evergreen Hollow for 5 years. It was the kind of town where people smiled as they passed each other, where gossip at the local diner was the daily entertainment, and nothing exciting ever really happened. That's why, when people started going missing, no one knew what to make of it. It began subtly, a stranger here, a traveler there. But when locals started disappearing, the town's peaceful facade began to crack. One foggy evening, Mira returned home from her shift at the hospital. She worked late hours, which she didn't mind because it meant she avoided most of the town's idle chatter. But this evening felt different. The air was thick with a strange silence. As she pulled into her driveway, she noticed something odd. Her front door was slightly ajar. Her heart raced, and 1,000 explanations flashed through her mind. Had she forgotten to close it in her morning rush? Was it the wind? Or was someone inside? She grabbed her phone and called the sheriff's office, but the line was busy. Typical. Sheriff Jacobs ran things like it was still 1960. No one bothered with 911 around here. You just called the sheriff directly. But with no answer, she was on her own. Cautiously, she pushed the door open. Nothing looked out of place at first. The cozy living room was just as she'd left it. Books piled on the coffee table. Her cat, Oliver, snoozing on the chair. But there was something off. A smell. Faint, but unmistakable. Earthy and metallic, like wet soil mixed with rust. She followed the scent into the hallway, her hands trembling as she reached for the light switch. The bulb flickered twice before casting a weak glow. The smell was stronger now, leading her toward the basement door. Mira hated the basement. Even on the sunniest of days, it felt like a different world down there. Cold, damp, and suffocating. But something was drawing her down now, and she couldn't ignore it. With shaky hands, she pulled the door open and stared down into the darkness. There was movement, barely perceptible, but enough to make her freeze. Was it her imagination? Her breath caught in her throat as she took a step down the creaky stairs. Her foot hit something solid, and when she looked down, she gasped. There, at the base of the stairs, was a muddy boot. And not just any boot. She recognized it instantly. It belonged to Tom Granger, the town's handyman, who'd gone missing 2 weeks ago. The boot was covered in dried blood. Suddenly, the hairs on the back of her neck prickled. She wasn't alone. She spun around, heart pounding, and was face to face with a figure standing at the top of the stairs, silhouetted by the dim light. It was tall, broad-shouldered, and motionless, just watching her. Now, here's where things get truly unsettling. The figure didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there, as if it had been waiting for her. The silence was deafening. Mira's mind raced, trying to piece together what was happening. She remembered the whispers around town, the unspoken fear in people's eyes whenever the disappearances were mentioned. And then, in a voice so low, it barely broke the silence, the figure spoke. "I've been watching you, Mira." It was a voice she knew all too well. Sheriff Jacobs. Her blood ran cold. He was the last person anyone would suspect. But now, everything started to make sense. The missing people, the lack of answers, the strange silences in the sheriff's office. He had been covering his tracks, making sure no one would find out. But why? What could have driven the beloved sheriff to do this? Before Mira could react, the basement door slammed shut, and the sound of heavy footsteps echoed down the stairs. She was trapped, with nowhere to go. And in that moment, she realized the true horror of Evergreen Hollow. There had always been a watcher in the shadows, and now the watcher had her in his sights. That's how it all unravels. The twisted truth behind a seemingly peaceful town, and the man sworn to protect it. It makes you wonder, doesn't it? Just how well do we know the people we trust? This was just the beginning of the story. What followed were revelations about Jacob's secret past, the web of lies he had spun for years, and how the townspeople had turned a blind eye, unknowingly enabling a monster in their midst. But that is a tale for another time. Mira's mind raced, her heartbeat deafening in the enclosed space. Her body wanted to scream, to run, but terror had rooted her to the spot. How could this be happening? Sheriff Jacobs, the man who'd attended her housewarming party, who'd brought her flowers when her mother passed, who smiled at her every morning as she walked to work, was standing at the top of her basement stairs, watching her like she was prey. With a low, gravelly voice, he spoke again. "You shouldn't have come home early, Mira." Her chest tightened as the realization sunk in. This wasn't just a chance encounter. He had been waiting for her. Mira's mind went into overdrive, scanning for any possible escape route. But there was none. The basement was a dead end, and she was trapped with him. The only way out was past the sheriff. Suddenly, Jacob started down the stairs, his boots echoing against the old wooden steps. One slow, deliberate footstep at a time. Mira's pulse raced, and she felt the sting of tears welling up in her eyes. How had she missed the signs? Why hadn't she seen the truth before it was too late? But Mira wasn't the type to give up easily. She had always been a fighter, and she wasn't about to become another missing person in Evergreen Hollow. With shaky hands, she reached behind her, searching for something, anything, that she could use as a weapon. Her fingers grazed a cold metal object, a wrench, not much, but it would have to do. Jacobs was halfway down the stairs now, his eyes gleaming in the dim light. "You've always been so curious, Mira," he said, his voice unnervingly calm. "Always asking questions, poking around. But some things are better left buried." Mira gripped the wrench tightly, her knuckles turning white. Her breath came in shallow gasps, but she steadied herself. She had to act fast. Just as Jacobs reached the bottom step, Mira lunged. The wrench collided with his shoulder, and he stumbled back, caught off guard by her sudden attack. The sheriff let out a growl of pain, but he didn't fall. Instead, he straightened, his expression darkening. "You shouldn't have done that," he hissed, advancing on her with a new intensity in his eyes. Mira scrambled backward, her heart pounding in her chest. She couldn't let him get the upper hand. Not now. Not when she was so close to escaping. The basement was small, cluttered with old boxes and forgotten tools. Mira's eyes darted around, looking for anything else she could use. But there was no time. Jacobs was closing in, his large frame blocking the stairs. "You think you can just leave?" Jacob said, his voice dripping with malice. "After everything I've done for this town, for you?" His words were laced with something far more sinister than anger. This wasn't about Mira personally. This was about control, about power. He had orchestrated everything, the disappearances, the cover-ups, and he had gotten away with it for years. No one had questioned him. No one had suspected the beloved sheriff. But now, Mira knew his secret. In a moment of desperation, Mira threw the wrench at Jacobs and darted toward the stairs. She didn't look back, didn't hesitate. Her only thought was, escape. She reached the top of the stairs and yanked the door open, sprinting through the hallway and out into the night. The cold air hit her like a wall. but she didn't stop running. Her legs burned. Her lungs screamed for air, but she couldn't stop. She could hear him behind her, his footsteps heavy and deliberate. He wasn't in a hurry. He knew the town better than anyone. Knew every hiding spot, every dead-end alley. He was the hunter, and she was his prey. But Mira had one advantage. Her determination. She wasn't going to let Jacobs win. As she ran through the empty streets of Evergreen Hollow, her mind raced. She couldn't go to the sheriff's office. It was his territory. She couldn't trust anyone. Jacobs had eyes everywhere. But there was one person she could turn to. Deputy Lee, a new hire in town who hadn't been tainted by years of working under Jacob's thumb. He was the only one who might believe her. Mira headed for the deputy's house, praying he would be home. The town was silent, eerily so, as if it was holding its breath, waiting for the inevitable. She could hear her own footsteps echoing off the buildings, the sound of her breath ragged in the night air. Finally, she reached Deputy Lee's house. She pounded on the door, her fists aching with the effort. "Lee, it's Mira, open up!" she shouted, her voice breaking. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then the door creaked open, and Lee stood there, his face etched with confusion. "Mira, what's going on?" he asked, his eyes scanning her disheveled appearance. "There's no time to explain," she gasped, pushing her way inside. "It's Jacobs. He's the one behind everything. The disappearances, the murders. He's been hiding it all." Lee stared at her, stunned. "Jacobs? Are you sure?" "I saw him. He was in my house. He tried to..." Her voice faltered, the weight of what had happened finally hitting her. Lee's face darkened as he grabbed his keys. "We need to get you to safety. Let's go." But as they headed for the door, the sound of tires crunching on gravel reached their ears. Mira's heart dropped. Jacobs had found her. Mira's pulse quickened as the rumble of tires against gravel echoed outside. Sheriff Jacobs had found them, and there was no time to waste. Deputy Lee's house was small, barely defensible against someone as cunning and relentless as Jacobs. "We need to move, now," Lee whispered urgently, grabbing his service weapon. Mira nodded, her mind racing for options. They couldn't take the main roads. Jacobs had the town under his control, and there was no telling how many people he had in his pocket. They needed a plan, and fast. Lee led her through the back door, out into the dark, winding woods behind his property. The towering trees provided some cover, but with Jacobs on their trail, it wouldn't be long before he caught up. The faint glow of the moon barely pierced through the canopy above, casting eerie shadows across the forest floor. "You have a plan?" Mira whispered as they moved deeper into the woods. "Stay low. Stay quiet," Lee replied, his voice barely audible. "I know these woods. We'll take the old hunting trail. It leads to the abandoned quarry. If we can make it there, we might have a chance to regroup and figure out our next move." As they pushed forward, Mira's mind churned with unanswered questions. How had Sheriff Jacobs managed to hide his crimes for so long? How many people were involved? And most importantly, why? What had driven him to such darkness? They moved in silence, the forest swallowing the sound of their footsteps. Every rustle of leaves, every crack of a twig, made Mira's heart leap into her throat. She glanced at Lee. His face was set in a grim determination. He knew what they were up against. Suddenly, the sound of an engine revving in the distance pierced the night air, followed by the beam of headlights cutting through the trees. Jacobs was getting closer. Lee grabbed Mira's arm and pulled her behind a thick tree trunk. "Stay still," he whispered, his eyes scanning the woods. They crouched low, holding their breath as the vehicle passed by, its light sweeping over the trees just inches away from their hiding spot. For a few agonizing moments, they waited in silence. Then, as the engine faded into the distance, Lee exhaled. "We need to keep moving. He'll double back once he realizes we're not on the road." Mira nodded, pushing down the rising panic in her chest. They couldn't afford to stop. Not yet. As they neared the quarry, the landscape shifted. The trees thinned, replaced by jagged rocks and loose gravel. The air grew colder, carrying the damp, musty scent of the quarry's stagnant water. It was an eerie, forgotten place, long abandoned and seldom visited. They reached the edge of the quarry, where the ground dropped steeply into a deep pit filled with dark, murky water. There were no more trees for cover, no more places to hide. "What now?" Mira asked, her voice shaky. Lee scanned the area, his eyes narrowing. "We'll hide out here just until morning. Jacobs won't risk coming down here at night. It's too dangerous, even for him. We'll have a few hours to regroup and figure out our next move." They found a small crevice in the quarry wall, just big enough to squeeze into. It wasn't much, but it would provide some shelter until they could come up with a plan. As they huddled in the darkness, Mira's mind wandered back to the last few weeks. The disappearances had started so subtly. First a drifter, then a local business owner. But no one had connected the dots. Not until now. She had always felt like something was off about Sheriff Jacobs. But she had never imagined this. And now, it was up to her and Deputy Lee to bring him down. But how could they, when the town had been blind to his true nature for so long? Hours passed and the night dragged on in silence. Every sound, the distant howl of a coyote, the soft rustle of the wind, kept Mira on edge. Her mind raced, cycling through the possible outcomes of their situation. Could they really survive this? Could they expose Jacobs and live to tell the tale? Suddenly, a faint noise broke through the stillness. A twig snapped, and the unmistakable sound of footsteps echoed through the quarry. Lee tensed beside her, his hand tightening around his gun. "He's here," Mira whispered, her heart racing. The footsteps grew louder, closer. Jacobs had found them. There was no more running, no more hiding. It was time to face him, to confront the evil lurking behind that familiar face. And just like that, the final confrontation was upon them. In the dim light of the moon, Sheriff Jacobs appeared at the edge of the quarry, his silhouette dark and imposing against the sky. His eyes gleamed with a mixture of triumph and madness. "You didn't think you could run forever, did you?" he called out, his voice echoing through the empty pit. Mira's blood turned to ice as she realized the terrifying truth. There was no escape. Jacobs had hunted them down, just as he had done with so many others. And now, it was time for the final reckoning. Mira's breath caught in her throat as Sheriff Jacobs stood at the edge of the quarry, the pale moonlight casting long shadows across his face. His calm demeanor had shifted, revealing a man who had long since abandoned any trace of humanity. "I've been keeping this town safe," Jacobs said, his voice low and steady. "Safe from people like you, who can't just leave well enough alone." Deputy Lee slowly rose to his feet, his gun drawn, aimed directly at Jacobs. "You're done, Sheriff. It's over. There's no place left to hide." Jacobs chuckled, his gaze fixed on Mira. "You think it's that simple? You think anyone will believe you over me? This town needs me. I'm the law here." Mira could feel the weight of his words. Evergreen Hollow had always trusted Jacobs, depended on him. For years, he had been a pillar of the community, a friendly face, a comforting presence. How could they expose him when the town was so deeply invested in the lie he had woven? But then something changed. Mira remembered something from her conversation with Lee earlier that night. It was a small detail, easily overlooked. Deputy Lee had been reviewing old case files, and there was one name that had stood out: Jennifer Lawson. Jennifer had disappeared almost a decade ago, long before the recent wave of missing persons. Her case had been ruled a runaway, but something about it had never sat right with Mira. She had been one of the few in town who had questioned the official story, but Jacobs had dismissed it at the time. Now, standing in the cold night air, Mira knew the truth. "You killed her, didn't you?" Mira's voice was barely a whisper, but it cut through the tension like a blade. Jacob's eyes flickered just for a moment, but it was enough. That was all the confirmation she needed. Jennifer Lawson had been the first, the start of it all, and Jacobs had covered it up, weaving his web of lies tighter and tighter until no one could see the truth anymore. Lee stepped forward, his gun still trained on the sheriff. "There's no running from this, Jacobs. We have evidence. The town will know what you've done." But Jacobs just shook his head, a cold smile creeping across his face. "Evidence? You think I haven't thought of that? You think I haven't planned for every